man, so if we're going to be throwing basic cylinder shapes, right, if we're going to be making cups, almost everything actually in ceramics kind of starts as a cylinder, and then we turn that cylinder into something else, right? This is exactly 1 pound of clay. What I really recommend y'all do, start weighing how much clay you're cutting off at a time. Try to only use 1 pound until you've mastered 1 pound. Like, I'm gonna throw quotes around master, right? But until you're really comfortable throwing this amount, because it's amazing how much of a pot you can get out of 1 pound. And if you throw with 2, you'll make the same pot, but it'll be really heavy in like the wrong places, right? So try whatever you're throwing to get as much out of a pot as you can, whether that be volume, height, whatever, with the minimum amount of clay as you possibly can, right? So for me, that's usually 1 pound. And I'm always surprised. I'm like, this is a giant mug body that I made out of 1 pound. So I've got 1 pound. I'm rounding it out on all sides, right? My wheel being on would be helpful. So we'll get this spinning. I'm going to dampen the wheel head here. This is also usually the point where I can feel if my bat has any sort of rock or wiggle to it, right? This one does. So what happens a lot, what happens a lot with these bats is they warp, right? One thing you want to be wary of, if a bat is warped in kind of a U shape, it will wobble like that, right? So what you want to do is flip it over, because if it's in a sort of N shape, it's not going to wobble as much. So you want it to arch this way. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. And now, it's not nearly as wobbly, right? And it's kind of an inevitability. That's one of the downsides to bats, but the benefits far outweigh the costs, right? And then if Lima, I'm sure she did, but just in case she didn't go over it, I really, really recommend every single person in this class buy at least 2 of their own bats, because we've got like maybe 50 of them, right? Same thing with these wear boards. We've got like 50 to 70 of them. By the end of the session, there will be 3 that we're all fighting for. You know what I mean? If you have your own bats, you don't ever have to worry about that. And then also, if you're throwing, I don't want you to leave work on bats overnight. Like, the bats need to go back on that shelf by the end of class, or by the end of your session that day, right? So just try to be very mindful of that. It is a community studio, and we want to just sort of set everyone else up for success and hope that they do the same to us. Okay?
But if it's your own bat, then you said you can leave your piece on.
Yeah, that's what I do. It's way easier. Yeah, if it's your own bat, or especially if you're throwing like bowls or plates, it's impossible to move a wet plate, right? But if you have your own bat, you can just set it outside till it's like, it tells you it's ready to be picked up, and then you can flip it. It just makes everything much easier, and they're not super expensive. You know what I mean? These, more so than almost any of the tools, I highly, highly recommend you get your own, right? The less you have to rely on the studio, the better, just because not everybody sets each other up for success. But I'd like to be the class that does, you know? So I've got this moistened. I'm gonna smack this down in the middle. I made sure that my ball of clay was really round on all sides. That way when I smacked it down, it kind of squished out and didn't trap any air in the end, okay? Another thing is, I don't wedge clay fresh out of the bag. I will maybe if it was porcelain or something that needs to be like sort of activated. This clay is really easy throwing, so you don't need to. And oftentimes you will wedge air into the clay in trying to wedge it out, right? So this goes through a de-airing machine at high water, so it will be fine just the way it is, okay? All right, we got that slammed down. I usually give it 2 firm smacks just to make sure. I'm really wary of the clay kind of jumping off and shooting at people, you know what I mean? So I'm gonna get that going. I'm gonna seal this bottom corner here. Again, just like another precaution so I don't launch clay at people. Then I'm gonna get this going to max speed. I do everything up until I actually pull at the fastest the wheel will go. That way the machine is doing a lot of the work for me, right? And then the way that I usually center is I use the chair karate chop method, right? So this hand makes a chair. It's got kind of a fulcrum where the point that applies the most pressure is actually right here, right? And this is wedged into my body. If I was sitting down, that would probably be wedged into my waist area, right? And I'm here. Thumb kind of wraps over like this. This one comes down and karate chops on top. And then I lean into the clay. I'm not using a lot of arm strength here. I'm just kind of letting my body weight lean into it, and that will... Someone get me a small stool. I want to get this out of the way so you guys can see. Marvelous. I appreciate it. But even just by doing that, I've got it almost perfectly centered just by making this a cup, making this a top karate chop, and leaning on it, right? The point of it is, You want to make like a jig with your hands and apply enough pressure and be unyielding in the shape that the clay becomes the shape of the jig that you made. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. So I'm just gonna get this. This clay does throw so easy too. It's really nice.
I know I ruined my first one because I was using way too much.
Yeah, you're used to having to use a lot of pressure. So this is a porcelaneous stoneware. What that means is it throws kind of like porcelain, except it's much easier, which is great. So that's like kind of perfectly centered. Yeah, and I barely had to do anything there. We're really lucky. Last session, a bunch of the folks that are in this class, we had to use this really gritty stoneware, and it was much more difficult to throw. So I've got it centered, but now I have to find the exact middle, right? Some people will teach you like, oh, you just go in with thumbs and you find the center point, or you just kind of guesstimate. I find when you do that, or when you guess and you don't have an exact center point, you end up a little bit off to the left or a little bit off to the right. When you do that, you're going to end up with a thick side and a thin side. After pulling, that'll turn into a tall side and a short side. We want to avoid that, right? So the very first thing I do is I make like little finger guns here. And I have just a smidge of downward pressure. I'm pushing that towards the center. And you guys can see it's making like this little ridge. I'm going to push through, and that ridge is going to turn into a divot. Right where that divot is where the very center of the piece is. And I'm going to exaggerate that divot so that I can find it easier later. Does that make sense to everyone? Now we know where the exact center point is. That way the corner of my finger can line up right there. With that exaggeration that I did too, I also made a little well so I can have a little bit of a lubrication reservoir there, right? So then I'm going to take my finger gun. It goes in here in the corner. And I'm going to push down at a 45-degree angle. I find that this isn't strong enough to do it on its own. So I sort of treat this as like a tool. And then this hand pushes that tool down, right? And again, everything I do in ceramics, two hands are always touching. Try to think of your two arms, your two hands as one mechanism in everything that they do, never as two separate things, right? So this is here, my mechanism connects, two hands touching. I go down at a 45-degree angle. If I start to get dry, I let off real easily. I'm gonna get it down to that like quote unquote like pottery thickness, which is roughly a 1/4 inch, right? Right around there, I think I'm good. And then if you're ever not sure, you can actually check the depth of this by using a needle tool. So what I do there is I will just stab a needle down into it, and then I will trace the needle down to where my finger touches clay and pull it off. And so it's a little bit thinner than a 1/4 inch, right? But still fine. If you do overshoot the thickness you were going for, you can make the bottom a little thicker by pushing some clay from the top corner down into the middle. And then you'll just have to really compress that later, right? So we're going to be making a cylinder. A cylinder has a straight side, a flat bottom, and a straight side. So there's two corners at the bottom here, right? Mine is kind of like rounded like a bowl on the inside now. So what I need to do next, I'll add some moisture. I take my finger gun, I flip it sideways, and I make kind of a claw like this, right? I make a little claw, and I pull that claw out towards myself, trying very hard to keep it as flat as possible. It's kind of tricky because this isn't like a super flat tool, right? But we just want to get it close. That way we can compress this and make it like a nice flat even surface, right? So I'm going to come down here, do some compression where I press down from the middle to the outside, to the middle to the outside. And this is going to ensure that we don't have any S-cracking, which is a crack that you get in the bottom of your piece if you don't do this part. Or if you dry it too quickly, or if your pot's too thin or too thick. There's a lot of, ceramics like doesn't want to be the thing you want it to be, right? Clay is like, nah, I think I'll just be a lump. So getting it to do what you want to do, you have to sort of work on its terms, you know what I mean? So that seems pretty good. And then I don't know if you guys notice, every time I go in to touch the clay or I let off, I'm very gentle with my movements. If I'm here and then I let off really quickly, it's really likely that my fingers or my hand is going to stick. It's going to throw the clay off center, and then I'm going to have a harder time going forward, right? So what I always like to imagine, I like to establish like analogies for everything. It helps me remember, right? Anytime I go in or I come off, I like to imagine myself like kind of jellyfishing away. Like it's very gentle movement. It's like it's real easy going, right? So get out to here, I'll jellyfish off of it, and then we'll see what we need to do next. So you guys can see, I sort of have a like flying saucer shape, right? The thing I've noticed when throwing is if you try to shoot for a cylinder, you end up with a bowl, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to establish what we want to make. So we're going to try to throw a cone shape. If we try to do that, based on like the fact that centrifugal force is constantly pulling the clay out, your head's also usually off to one way or the other, so you think you're pulling up, but you're actually pulling outwards. We're going to try to really exaggeratedly throw a conical shape, right? This is the antithesis of that right now. So what I'm going to do first is get this more cone shape from the get-go. And I do that by taking a finger, pressing it down into the corner there, and kind of just leaning my finger up and over until it's more of a cone shape. I usually do that with a sponge wrapped around my fingers. A lot of what I do usually has a sponge wrapped around my fingers. I like to think of it as like sponge armor, you know what I mean, that wraps around my middle finger here. It usually acts as like a lubrication reservoir because my fingers have a tendency to dry out clay very quickly, right? So it basically would look like this with the sponge. And now we have a nice cone shape that we're going to pull up, right?
It's not is it on max speed still?
No. So okay. I could do that on max speed, right? It's usually right here that I'll slow down to this kind of medium fast, you know what I mean? Working too slow will mess you up. It's kind of like throwing a lot of clay when you're not quite ready for it is really difficult, but also throwing like a teeny tiny bit of clay is also quite difficult. 1 pound's kind of the sweet spot where it like stops being tricky because it's so small, but it's not so large that it's difficult, right? Same thing goes with speed. You could do, theoretically, the whole process really fast, and your hand movements could be fast. Speed isn't as important as consistency of how fast your hands move in relativity or relation to how fast the wheel is going. So theoretically, I could throw like this fast if I wanted to. I would just have to have my hands move so slowly, right? Which is not, your hands are, you're human, right? You move around a lot. So I find that this kind of like medium fast, like here's kind of the sweet spot for where I can move relatively quickly, but I don't have to move really quickly if I don't want to. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, very good. So I'm going to make my little sponge armor, right? What I do is I kind of have my finger here, it wraps around like this. And then I'm going to squeeze these two hands together, or these two fingers together, right? 2 middle fingers, like so. And then I'm going to rise up as I squeeze. Now, it's very important that you remember these aren't 2 hands, this is one mechanism. So think of your hand kind of like a claw machine, right? So you go down, you claw in, and then you pull up, and you're pulling in towards the center because you want to make a cone shape, right? And then the floor of the pot, or rather the inside should always be a smidge higher than the outside because the inside has a floor and the outside doesn't. Does that make sense? So basically you're going to be squeezing in like this, and then rising up, like this, and then rising up, okay? They're not always like even keel. So those two squeeze together, go down to the very bottom corners of each side, squeeze together, pull up, and I'm really trying to exaggeratedly pull up into a cone shape, right? So that's my first pull. And then clay is finicky in that like it needs to be moist to do what you want it to do, but if it's too moist for too long, it sort of collapses on itself. So there's a lot of do the thing you want to do, take all the moisture out, add more moisture, do the next thing you want to do, you know what I mean? You just don't want to leave a ton of moisture in there for too long. One of the easiest ways I found to get the inside and the outside moisturized evenly is I kind of take scissors and sort of float along the edge here and then drip over my knuckles, and then I get both sides. And I usually do the first 2 or 3 pulls with this sponge. I call these like the muscle pulls. This is really where I'm trying to pull up as much of the clay from the bottom corner as I can. All right, so that's 2. Let's get that saturated again. I might do 1 more. And I'm kind of gouging in the clay at the bottom. I don't know if you guys can see that, so that I have clay to work with. And then I'm lifting that clay up.
Are you talking about the skirt outside?
Yeah, so like this skirt area, what I'm doing is I'm kind of trying to force it in rather than cutting it off later. That'll yield me more height. There's a certain point where I like stop worrying about that, and I'm like, this is tall enough for the size of piece that I have or the size of clay that I started with. So I do those muscle pulls, right? And I have a lot of pressure at the bottom. I ease off sort of continually as I get towards the top. Up here, I really don't have very much pressure because I don't want the top to be razor thin, right? Same thing applies when I do what I call like dexterity pulls. That's when it's just my fingertips. I call them that because you can feel what's happening a lot easier. So again, 2 hands always touching. Your 1 claw machine. Push that clay in at the bottom. And then really exaggeratedly try to imagine you're pulling up into a cone shape. If you do that enough times, you will end up with a cylinder. Granted, this cylinder is slightly conical. Like, it's real easy to make things wider, right? It's very difficult to make a wide thing skinnier. So I'd rather have a shape that did this, that I can then, if I want to, go out a little bit, than a shape that did this, where it'd be really tricky to fold it back in, okay? So now I'm gonna mop all my water out. And like, this is a relatively large-sized, like cup shape or mug shape for 1 pound, you know what I mean? So this is what like sort of the benchmark I want you guys to achieve. This is probably roughly 5.5 inches tall, right? See if we can get any more out of it. Probably not. This is usually the point where the clay's like, I'm tired. You can't overwork clay, right? So I'd rather, this is usually the point where I'll stop. From here, the only thing I really recommend doing is using a wooden rib. The tools I use the most are probably just sponge, wooden rib, maybe wooden knife, right? But what you need to do is I have this wall, I have all these finger grooves and stuff, which is fine if you like that aesthetic. It's not my favorite. But also, I kind of have a weak wall. So what I want to do is I want to compress the wall against something firm, almost like I compress the bottom beforehand, right? That means I can have a piece that's thin, but still very strong, because all those molecules are kind of lined up on top of each other, right? So the way I do that is I kind of gouge this in at the bottom, get rid of some of that skirt, keep this as vertical as I can, and with my fingertip on the inside, I'm just pressing lightly. Oh. Once it gets real thin, it wants to fold over on you like that, so be wary. Pressing lightly against this rib. And you can see that gets rid of all the slip from the outside, which will yield you a piece that dries faster. It gets rid of all of the throwing lines if you don't like those. If you do, that's fine. You can throw them back in. And it also strengthens the walls, right? So now that I'm here, my top got thrown off just a little bit when it wanted to collapse on me, but it's pretty even. I think that's fine. The last thing I'll do is I will cut some of the skirt off. So if you think of this as like an actual knife, this would be the sharp part, right? This is like your chopping vegetables way. What I do is I take it this way, or almost like if I was gonna like practice my throwing knives or something, right? I flip it upside down. I want the sharp side to point towards the clay. And I'm gonna come in here. I'm gonna gouge some of that clay out so that we have less trimming to do later. And I have to have pretty firm pressure when I do that. And we're really not trying to force the clay from the corner in. I'm trying to gouge that clay and then sort of lean it out. There should be kind of a moat going on like you see here, right? Now, super important step, I'm gonna fill that moat with water. I do that by angling this at the piece and then dripping water into it. If I do that, it'll separate really easily. If I don't have this step, when you try to cut it off, it's really likely that it'll jump back up on the clay and then it'll be stuck there again, right? What's that? Yeah, and so what I usually do after that, right, is I take a little chunk here, and I kind of just spin this around, and then most of the way, it should kind of separate right off. Like so. I'll clean that last little bit up, right, because I kind of made a mess. So I'll use this as kind of a rib there, just to really establish the shape that I want. Check it from the bottom, see if that's a shape that you like. This is a fine shape, but not my favorite. I like it to flare out a little bit towards the top. It gives you a tiny bit more volume. Check it out. That's pretty cylinder shape. I think we'll call it there. Make sure there's no water on the inside, right? And then the last thing that I do, if I'm throwing something that's going to be drunk from, is I give it a drinking edge. There's kind of two schools of thought here. One of them is to have like a really chunky rounded lip, and that's great if you're like making mugs for a diner down the way, right, where they're going to go through like an industrial dishwasher, they're going to be thrown into bus bins, all that jazz. I don't know if you ever drink out of something like that, but your mouth has corners and those things don't, so they dribble really easily. So on every piece that I'm making that's going to be a drinking vessel, I give it sort of a cornered edge like this, and I do that so it fits into the corners of your mouth, and it's a much nicer drinking experience, okay? So from here, we're done. That's our cylinder, right? The last thing we got to do is we got to cut it off. And again, if this wasn't my bat, I would have to cut it off and try to finagle moving it, and it's real likely that you're going to mess it up, right? Especially if you threw it thin. So I'm going to cut this off underneath there. And then if this was my bat, I'm careful when I bring it out because the bat pins like to stick in, as you can see here. But I'm just going to wiggle those guys out. And if this was my bat, all I would do is I would leave it out. until it was firm enough to grab, right, without distorting it. So maybe like a really soft leather hard. And then I would flip it upside down, and depending on when I was coming back, I would cover it either with cloth, if I'm coming back in 24 hours, or I would cover it with plastic really well if it's going to be a day or two. You know what I mean? And so we'll just leave this one and then move it whenever we need to move it, okay? So trimming tools, which everyone should have kind of a basic pottery tool set, so you should have a couple of these, right? The ones I find to be the most important is this tool. Some people call this a loop tool, some people call this a paracord. I usually call it a paracord. And then some people call this a ribbon tool, and some people call it a loop tool. I call it a loop tool, right? I just, small cutty bit, big cutty bit, right? That's the only thing that really matters. So first thing we need to do is, having my pot would probably be important. I've got a pot that's pretty nice leather hard, right? Like I can pick clay out of the bottom pretty easily. If you let this get too dry, it becomes a little bit more difficult. I'm gonna set this here. You do need a needle tool as well, so you can find the perfect center. And then you also need some extra clay. Theoretically, this works best if it's the same clay body as the piece you're throwing, but for this demo purposes, I'm gonna use white clay on red clay. I'm gonna roll this into like a little bit of coil, so I can use it for lugs, right? So first things first, we need to center this. Everything's got to be sort of true to the middle, right? Same thing as when we're throwing, and it's real important that you get it centered, or every other step after that is more difficult. So I'm gonna get this spinning, and I'll kind of just eyeball it first to see like how far it's off. And remember, I don't care how far the like lip of this piece, so the bottom now, it can be way off and it doesn't matter. I'm not trimming that part. I'm trimming this part, right? So I need this to be in the middle. And it's pretty likely, especially as beginners, that when you're throwing, you'll kind of have a different top center than bottom center. It's like actually like very likely, right? So I kind of eyeball it, see where it needs to go off. I do that sometimes by just putting a finger here, inching it closer till it touches in one particular spot. And I can see that by where my fingernail gouged in, right? Where that fingernail gouge is, I'll aim it right at myself, and then I'll move it forward just a smidge. Now, an easier way to do that besides the fingernail thing is to use a needle tool, right? Kind of do the same thing. And remember, we're only ever affecting the bottom third of a pot, so I don't want to do my gouges way down here, right? I want them to be in the bottom third. So I'm going to do that, and I don't have so much pressure that I'm like, gouging through the pot really easily, right? And I also don't want to move the pot. It's like I'm just letting the sharpness do the work there, right? You can see that big gouge right there. So I'm going to aim that gouge where the center or deepest part is directly at myself, and move it forward just a smidge. And then we will repeat. And I like to start kind of as low as I want to go, and then each continual one is a little bit higher, that way I don't get confused. The highest one now is over here, and it'll jump around a little bit on you. The easiest way to center is to tap center. It's very tricky to do, so like if you guys have any practice with it, it's really, really beneficial. But what the concept there is, instead of letting the needle tool like clip where it's closest, you would tap it a little bit. Centrifugal force has a tendency to kind of throw it exactly into perfect middle. It's very difficult to do. If anyone wants like some lessons on how to do that, we can sort of go over that one-on-one, you know what I mean? That will make your life easier. And so this is, to me, is centered enough, right? This method is not perfect in that I don't want to spend like 40 minutes being like, now a quarter centimeter this way. Like, I don't care, right? It's a cut. So there is close enough for me. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my lugs of clay that I have. I'm going to, with firm pressure on the top, but not so much pressure that I'm collapsing it, right? I'm going to push pressure down, and I'm going to make a lug, and I'm going to push these down at kind of a 45-degree angle so that it makes kind of a finger that grabs onto the piece, right? I usually do 3 of those. That first one I did was huge, so I might not need 3. Theoretically, you could have a ring all the way around, you know what I mean? Over here, push it down to 45. Now let's just make them all connect. And a full claw keeping everything together, right? So downward pressure. And you have the downward pressure because your fingers will have a tendency to move the pot a little bit. If you move the pot and you get off of that pretty close to perfect center, you have to start all over, right? We want to avoid that. So now I've got that sealed down pretty well. The first thing I do is most pots, and especially beginner pots, right? The bottom corner here is where you're going to have the most weight, so you're going to have to remove the most weight from right here, right? So I'm going to start there. Take my trimming tool, hold it usually like a pencil, and I have a finger in the middle, sort of as a stabilizing agent, and then also two hands touching always, right? And then I'm going to just slowly but surely carve away that corner a little bit because I know that's where the most clay is. We'll get it roughly to there. So I took away like quite a bit from that. And I don't know if you guys can see, but I had like smooth, even ribbons coming off when I was trimming. That's what you want. If you're ever trimming and it's coming off as like these weird little crumbly bits, your piece is probably a little bit too dry. If it's ever coming off as dust, stop. It's way too dry to trim, okay? And the dust that you make is like super poisonous to everybody, so we want to avoid. We try to keep as little dust in the studio as possible. There are ways, if you let a pot get too dry and you can't trim it anymore, to clean up the foot, right? Maybe we'll go over that next week, but that'll be done outside because it's very dusty, okay? So I've got the weight out of that corner. Now I need to get rid of all those lines that I carved in and also sort of address the shape that I have right here. So I'm just going to move this down, and again, we're usually only fussing with the, oh, did you guys see that my pot kind of rose up there? That happens sometimes if the like claw that you make isn't quite firm enough. And also, like, because it's a tall piece, it's like sort of inevitably top heavy and wants to bounce out. If this was a bowl, theoretically, I wouldn't even need clay on the outside if it was a wide enough bowl. So just something to be mindful of. Don't overdo your pressure because you will have a tendency to make your pot like jump out of its like cradle, right? So we'll try that again. That's another reason you have downward pressure in the middle here, is to hopefully prevent that. So I'll just go a little bit more gentle with my trimming. I got a little over ambitious. Again, we're only trimming the bottom third because the top 2/3 should be relatively even and light because that's the easy part to throw. This bottom corner is much more difficult to throw. And things to keep in mind when you're trimming, right? You're trimming for aesthetic's sake. You're trimming so that your bottom isn't so thick that you get an S-crack in it. And then you're also trimming for weight. That was the thing I didn't do for like years. I would just trim because I thought it made things look pretty and it makes things flat so they don't rock on a table, right? But all my pots were really heavy for a long time. So that's another thing to bear in mind is if you have a pot and it feels really heavy for how big it is, like that's not a good pot, is what I would consider, right? Or rather that pot needs more work until it's like the point it needs to be. It should theoretically feel light for its size, but even just feeling like, yes, this doesn't seem overly heavy in one particular part, that's fine. A pot can be thick and substantial so long as it's thick evenly throughout the pot. Does that make sense? You don't want just like a really bottom heavy pot. That's not what we're shooting for, right? So that should be good. Take a look. I don't love this little transition here, so I'm just gonna one more second. This is usually the part where I fuss, like I overly fuss on pots for too long. So I might actually call it quits pretty close to here so that I'm not spending 45 minutes making a corner look better. Theoretically, you could be done close to this, right? You do want some sort of bevel going on down here. It's very difficult to get a surface that's this wide completely flat, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to have this tool sort of working, I don't know, what would that be? Parallel to like my body, you know what I mean? And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to try to just make the top flat. Sometimes where your wire tool gouges, it has a tendency to make things kind of uneven. So I want to just kind of start fresh and trim away until it doesn't have any of that unevenness, right? I can also take a little bit more out of the corner now, because I want the pot to have some lift. If you have a pot that just ends like this one does, it looks inherently heavy. But if this has an undercut on the bottom, it makes it look lighter. So now that I've got that corner established, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this like a proper footwell, right? Or foot ring. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come in here, take some clay out of this inside corner.
You're right at the edge.
What's that?
You're right at the edge.
I'm pretty close to the edge, but I have like a little sort of band, and that's going to be my foot ring. You don't want a foot ring that's super wide, because again, the wider the surface, the harder it is to get completely flat, right? So I took clay just out of this little corner here, and I'm not going to go crazy with this one because I threw this pretty light on purpose, because I didn't intend on trimming this one when I was throwing it. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to take the sort of corner of my tool, and I'm going to gouge out a spiral of clay until I reach that corner that I established, right? Theoretically, you could just leave that spiral if you like the look of it, right? But if you don't, you're just trying to get rid of weight. What I then do will be take all the ridges and high spots down with this sort of flat side of my tool. This is how you're able to trim kind of evenly the whole surface, right? So just get that.
From the center out.
Yeah, I usually move from the center out, yeah. And then I'll check it. A thing that has a tendency to happen is this point has a tendency to be a little bit higher than the outside point. I think because, at least for me, this is usually the thinnest part of my bottom anyways when I'm throwing, so I'm always kind of worried that I'm going to go through. So don't overdo it, but you do have to be mindful that this has to sit lower than this, right? So I'm just going to spend some more time cleaning it up. Getting rid of clay. If you're ever pushing on the bottom of something and it feels like it has any give, stop trimming. Like, doesn't matter if the bottom's ugly, don't trim anymore. It's real likely that you're about to trim right through it, right? Push this out to the corner. And you don't have to have a super deep foot, you know what I mean? Like, the point of it is really we just want like a ring of flatness because it's a little bit easier to ensure that that's perfectly flat than the whole thing. I might take a smidge more clay out of the corner because the corner usually has the most weight. I don't want to get greedy with this because I'm right at that stage where if I push too far, I'm going to end up with a planter that I didn't want to have, right? Which is fine. And if you trim through pots or you have pots that dry out too much and you don't get a chance to trim them, save them all because when we do see, right here it's starting to sort of move in on me, so I'm going to call it. The center is usually the thinnest point. One thing you do want to make sure of though, I'll stop this. Grab something wider, that's flat, right? Wider than your base is here. And you want to set it on there. You just want to make sure that the outside edge is indeed the tallest point, right? And it is on this piece, so I know that this piece is done. So now all I'm going to do is, I could probably just grab this and finagle it out. Yeah, and I'll leave this out for you guys to sort of feel, right? Try to only grab it from this side because this is a little moist. I probably could have got a little bit more out of it, but again, I didn't want to over trim it and have it be a planter, right? But this is what I will call done, and I've got like a nice foot ring. It'll sit really flat on a table now. Aesthetically, I think it's a little bit nicer looking. It's got that undercut to have a little bit of lift here, right? So